Yo ho, me hearties, welcome to another episode of Bumbling Through Dungeons. I'm not going to do the pirate voice for the whole thing, but my name is Mark. Today we're talking about roll versus roll. So do you roll or do you roll? Are you confused yet? Good. So I will disambiguate what I mean by this topic, which might be apparent from just reading the description, but sometimes it's not as apparent as I think it is because, a lot of it's in my head. So I will explain. So when I say roll versus roll and when to do either one, there's a couple different things that I could be talking about, or a couple different verses that I'm talking about. One is, do you make decisions for your character based on mechanics or based on role playing? We're going to talk about that today, and when you might want to do both, and what are some considerations for one or the other. And the other way that I mean it is when you're playing in a session, either as a player or certainly as a DM, do you handle it in a way that involves dice rolling? So it takes it into the mechanics of the game, the crunchier mathematical mechanics of the game, or do you handle it in a way that involves role playing? We're going to talk about some considerations for that today as well. So let's talk about that first one, roll versus roll, when you're choosing a character, building a character, statting them out, and leveling them up, and doing fun things with creating the character of your dreams. I hope it's the character of your dreams. But there is sometimes, oftentimes for me, if I'm being honest, a bit of tension when I'm creating a character and then leveling them up, because I have a certain idea of who this character is and who I'd love for them to become. And that plays into the mechanics, whether it's the spell casting or the abilities or the feats that you can take at certain levels. Feats allow you to specialize in certain things that you might not otherwise be able to with just your class mechanics in 5th edition D&D. And so you want to do something that is very thematic, that is very on point with the role-playing that you're doing. But there is, and I'm not going to lie, there really is, even as someone who, at this point in my life, appreciates the role-playing elements probably a little bit more than the crunchier math, I do enjoy both of them. And when you're in those crunchier math portions of the game, you want to do well. So when you're in combat, you want to do a lot of damage. You want to tank a lot of damage. You want to heal a lot of damage. And you want to be able to help yourself and help the party and help the campaign and whatever you're trying to do, help your allies, your NPC allies. That feels good. And so there are decisions that you want to make then when you're leveling up that are strictly mathematical decisions, but maybe not the most thematic. So there isn't one answer to which do you take and when. The answer is going to be personal. It's going to be your answer for your character, and that's as it should be. But sometimes, occasionally, I have found that you can have your cake and eat it too. It helps to have a very defined sense of who your character is and what they're about and what you want to bring to life in a thematic sense, in a role-playing sense. And it'll allow you to compromise in those areas where you don't necessarily need everything to be thematic. So you might be able to identify one or two abilities that are really defining of your character in a thematic sense. And anything outside of that might be nice, but you can also take, whatever's going to deal the most, you can take whatever's going to deal the most damage or be the most helpful to the group or whatever it might be. There are other times where there isn't a clear answer, and I'm not going to be able to give you a clear answer. But one thing that I'll say is that when you have so many options in D&D, and at this point the number of class options and spell options and archetype options and background options gives you so much room to play with that it's often not an either-or proposition. We're like, okay, you level from 3 to 4. Here you might take a thematic feat. Great. Beautiful. And then for the next 3 or 4 levels, you're taking things that are just to optimize your character in a combat sense or in a social scene or, whatever it is that you want to specialize in. You're taking the things that are going to make you the best at those things, whether or not they're the most thematic to the character that you've built. And then maybe a few levels later, oh man, all right, well, here's something that I think would be really cool, but it's going to be a little bit suboptimal, and you make that decision. It's not zero sum, is what I'm saying. So I do think it's a fun consideration. I think the other thing that you have to be careful of is that if you're playing one way, so if you're playing a wildly suboptimal character for role-playing purposes, and you're in a group of min-maxers who are optimizing the heck out of their characters to be absolutely efficient machines in every conceivable area of the game, there probably are going to be times where you feel left out or you feel like you're not contributing as much, and that can sting a little bit when everybody wants to feel like they're contributing. That's the case with most groups. So I think that if you're going hard to one side or hard to another, it's worth having discussion with your group. I think that's the only thing that I would say is the real true consideration of, well, maybe you might not want to do that crazy idea that you have that's going to be suboptimal, because if you're not going to be helping out much, eventually you might grow to resent that character, or you might not. But for some groups, that could be an issue. So in the one campaign where I had a very distinct character that I wanted to bring to life, I knew that mechanically they weren't going to be the most powerful, and I was okay with that. And it was still a very fun character to play, and my group was super cool with it, and it worked well with the group. But I definitely noticed that I was the least useful in our encounters. I wasn't doing anything in social encounters that others couldn't do and do better than me, and I wasn't doing anything in combat that others couldn't do or couldn't do better. And so I became not useless, but it was very clear that I was not pulling the same amount of weight as the rest of the group. And so nobody minded. It wasn't an issue with the group because we were all on the same page with everything going on in the campaign. But if you don't have that, it could be an issue. So that's my only point. If you're looking for some of these compromise solutions, though, I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to check out Xanathar's Guide to Everything, which has a lot of tools for the game, both for DMs and for players. And one of the things that I love about Xanathar's is the spells that it introduced into the game. And usually the spells in Xanathar's Guide to Everything are similar to some other spell that already exists, and oftentimes they're slightly less powerful, but they're way more thematic. And therefore, for a particular archetype or class or persona, they're going to be a lot more fun to use, and you're usually not having to sacrifice much in the way of mechanical utility. So it might only be a tiny bit less useful or a tiny bit less powerful than whatever it's similar to from the player's handbook, for example. And I'm happy to make that trade for something that helps to define my character a lot more. So I love that they threw us that bone in Xanathar's Guide. I think there are a ton of spells that fit that purpose. One example that I'll give you is it's a spell called Zephyr Strike. Hope I'm pronouncing Zephyr Strike, one of those two. In any case, it is for rangers, and it essentially replaces Hunter's Mark, which a lot of people have said, especially when it was just the player's handbook, that Hunter's Mark was almost a mandatory spell for... Sorry, did I say hunters? I meant rangers. In my mind, hunters and rangers are interchangeable words, but for rangers. And a lot of people said, okay, Hunter's Mark is a mandatory spell for rangers. You have to take this or you're doing so much less damage that you're not even going to be useful. And I don't like to think of any spell as being necessary, so I hated to see people talking about it that way. Zephyr Strike is mechanically, looks to be a little bit less good than Hunter's Mark. You're not going to do quite as much damage with it. However, there's some really fun stuff that it does allow you to do. And for my particular character, where I had this spell, it became the signature spell for that character. I was using it a bunch, and I was using it in interesting ways and finding oblique uses for some of the other things that it gives you that aren't just straight up damage. So I would encourage you to check out that spell, especially if you're a ranger. And I would encourage you to check out a lot of the spells in Xanathar's because they do very similar things of replacing most of what another spell will give you and maybe giving you one or two other things that are going to be a lot of fun to bring to life. All right, so that was roll versus roll. So now let's talk about roll versus roll, because this video makes sense. All right, so the other thing that I'm talking about when I say roll versus roll is, let me give you an example. This became apparent to me when a certain thing happened in a session. So I went a whole session as a player in a game one time without rolling a single die, not one. And at first I thought to myself, like, is that good? And I didn't necessarily think it was, because I'm thinking to myself, well, D&D is about, rolling the dice and seeing what happens. It was, we didn't get into combat, obviously, or as people shoot off fireworks in my neighborhood here. If you can hear that, apologies, but whatever. So it wasn't, it was a role-playing heavy session. We obviously didn't get into combat where there would have been dice rolling. We almost got into combat, but the few dice rolls that had to happen, either in social scenes or in that brief almost combat, were made by other characters, other players in the game. So I didn't roll a single die in the whole session. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, you know what? I had fun, so what's the issue? And I think the answer is there isn't any issue. If you can handle things outside of the dice rolling, outside of those mechanics, and you're having fun and you're making progress either as characters or as a party or within the plot, who cares? Like, that can be completely valid. Now, that was an exception. That was an anomaly. And it hasn't happened before or since. So I don't think it's something where it's going to be that extreme most of the time where you're not rolling dice. But as a DM, if you can present scenes and entire sessions where maybe the players handle it in a way that will require dice rolls, maybe it won't, I don't think you as a DM need to feel obligated to give your players skill checks in order to justify what's going on. If you're handling it narratively, if you're handling it through discussion and dialogue and things like that, and you're all invested in what's going on, then everything's going to be fine. And you can go have the big dice rolling combat encounter next session or the one after that or whatever. So I would probably shy away from running multiple sessions, especially in a row like this, because I don't like my game to stagnate with one type of play. So I like to mix and match the variety of things that are getting thrown at the players. But on a one session basis or a scene to scene basis, I don't think you always need dice rolls. I don't think you always need skill checks, but there are other times where I think that the skill check enhances that. So the art, not science, of when do you do a skill check, when do you not do a skill check, is a broad enough topic that it would deserve its own video. So I'm not going to be touching too much on that. But in a broader sense, I think this consideration is one that DMs can take into games that they run where, okay, I don't need to force skill checks unless I think it makes sense within that scene, within that session, or whatever. And from the player's side, now, if your DM calls for a skill check, you are going to be rolling a die, and that's going to happen sometimes whether you're trying for it or not. But I think that especially after you've played as a group and played with a particular DM for a while, you can get a sense of when they will call for skill checks, in what situations, and how frequently they'll call for skill checks. And you can cater your play to do things that will either trigger skill checks or combat or whatever, or you might be able to do things that avoid it. And as a player, it might be interesting to try to approach a situation in a way where you can avoid combat, or you can avoid, having to make a persuasion or intimidation roll. See if you can figure out how to solve a problem narratively without those things, without having to roll a 20 on your persuasion roll or something like that. And if persuasion's your thing and you want to do that, absolutely go for it. But I think it's another avenue, another tactic, another strategy that you can take into any situation in a D&D session to say, all right, well, what are my options here? All right, attack this person, go right into combat, or bargain with them, or find some other strategy that maybe isn't going to be as overt. And sometimes it will still require a dice roll, but sometimes it won't. And I think some of the more interesting sessions that I've had as both DM and player have been the ones where they've been combat light and there hasn't been a whole lot of dice rolling. So as I said, I think it's an anomaly with that one session where I didn't roll a single die. I don't anticipate that ever happening again, because I've never come close to it. I don't keep track of how many times I roll the dice in each session, but, I'm not coming close to zero pretty much ever. So that was definitely an anomaly, but it made me see the value in approaching situations without having to roll dice constantly. So both can be fun, but I think there are two different avenues that you can explore within the same campaign. All right, so we talked about roll versus roll, and we talked about roll versus roll. So the only thing left to talk about is roll versus roll. No, that's really everything that I wanted to discuss in this video. And I have found a lot of interesting ways to think about both. Whether it's the dice rolling in a session or whether it's talking about the roll of your character versus the rolling of the dice of your character and which you're trying to optimize for. It's been very interesting to think through those situations and come up with answers that are right for me. As with most of these videos, I'm not ever going to presume to say what the right answers will be for you, but in presenting the considerations, in presenting the ideas and the tactics and strategies, hopefully you're getting some ammunition, some fuel to bring into your own gaming to make it more interesting, more diverse, and better suited to what you want to do in D&D. So that's all I got. I hope you have a good week. I don't know if one of these is coming out next week because I record these well in advance. So whenever you're seeing this, I hope you're having a good day. This is one of the last videos I'm recording right now in this batch, and it's going to be getting released well into 2021, but I'm recording this in August of 2020. So wherever you are, I hope you're doing well. I hope you're safe. I hope this COVID-19 nightmare is over, but that's been on my mind quite a bit recently because we are smack dab in the middle of it. But wherever you are in the world and in life, I hope you're doing well. And until the next video, take care.